With that, I'll go ahead and introduce our Dean, Andrew Butler, who's the Dean at the University of Alabama at Birmingham School of Health Professions. Dean Butler.
Thanks, Jim. Again, let's give a round of applause for Jim and all the organizers. What a great event space. I really haven't been to Haven before, and it's absolutely a lovely event space, and I had the opportunity to come around and say hello to many of you, so thank you for coming, and thanks Jim and Megan and all the organizers for this. Welcome to Looking Different. What is now, I can't believe it, the third annual art event from the UAB School of Health Professions Research Collaborative, hosted by our friends at NCHPAD, the National Center on Health, Physical Activity, and Disability, in combination with CEDHARS, another acronym, the UAB Center for Engagement in Disability Health and Rehabilitation Sciences. These art events address and explore the interaction of disability and society. Tonight's event features the artwork portrait of Rosemarie Garland-Thomson from Riva Lehrer's exploration of cultural depictions of disability, a discussion between Lehrer and Garland-Thomson, and a short reading from Lehrer's critically acclaimed memoir, Golem Girl. And if you haven't gotten the book, it's over there. I have my copy as well. I'm looking forward to reading it. Our goals in the school are to improve the health and well-being of people everywhere. And the research collaborative, led by Dr. Rimmer, does just that. We're glad to support and foster an environment that provides expert skills, research, and innovation, but it's more than that. These art events promote all of our values in the School of Health Professions: collaboration, compassion, caring, service, social responsibility, respect, integrity, and stewardship. Thank you for joining us for Looking Different. And now, I'd like to introduce the Director of the School of Health Professions Research Collaborative, Dr. Jim Rimmer.
Okay, I just have a few comments. Again, thank you for coming out tonight. I wanted to start with a quotation from Alice Shepard, who's a famous dancer who's done groundbreaking work in disabled choreography and dance. And if you haven't seen any of her artistic events, you can search YouTube for Alison Shepard, and they're amazing of what she does in the dance form in a wheelchair with other wheelchair users. So it's a fascinating expression of artistic quality that she has so dearly devoted much of her life to. And she said in one of her interviews that disability is not a deficit. It is a site of creativity, resistance, and artistry. So just think about that for a moment. It is not a deficit. And so often in our society, we often think of this as a negative when it's obviously a superpower to many people in the United States who have this lived experience. So we're really excited about continuing this third annual Disability Art event. We believe that Birmingham can really flip the script from being the civil rights mecca of the United States to the disability rights mecca of the United States, and we can hope to continue this event for many years to come. There are many people who made this evening possible, and we're grateful to every one of them. First, a nod to our 2023 and 2024 featured artists, Harper Nichols and Jessica Blinkhorn, whose powerful work is still on display in our center, which is located on the Lakeshore campus, called the Wellness, Health, and Research Facility. If you haven't been there, please come out to see this beautiful expression of art. A huge thank you. I think we really need to clap for Megan Mills. You did a fantastic job. Thank you, Megan. It's not easy putting on one of these events. Anybody who's done anything, a wedding, a bar mitzvah, a christening, whatever it may be, there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes, and Megan put this all together and choreographed a wonderful event. So thank you. To Janice Buffett, thank you for the food and the quality of the logistics, and the venue have been great. We really appreciate all you've done to make this, a very enjoyable event. Thank you, Janice. Our financial team is not here tonight. Well, is Delisha here? Hey, Delisha. So thank you, Delisha. It's not easy getting airline tickets scheduled for Riva and Rosemarie, and you stuck with it. There were changes that had to be made. Flights were canceled because we were hoping to have this event earlier in the year. And you did a great job. So thank you so much, Delisha, for everything you've done to get all that paperwork for Riva and Rosemarie so they can get paid after the event. Yeah, special thanks. Also, just a couple others. The communications team, Matt Gorham is here. Thank you, Matt, Will Harris, and Stephen Lanzi. Great job on the communication side, so we appreciate it. Special thank you to Kevin Storr. I don't think he's here tonight, but Kevin did a great job. He sort of runs the Director of Communications in the School of Health Professions. Thank you to Kevin. And then a shout out to Will Harris, who recorded 2 great podcast episodes with Riva and Rosemarie, available on our website and social media. The podcast is called Wellness, Health, and Everything Else, or the acronym WE, and we know we like a lot of acronyms around here, so thank you, Matt. WE. Everybody say it all one. WE. That's where you can find these 2 great podcasts, so we're excited about that. Okay, accessibility is always a top priority for us. We do whatever we can, and we hope that this facility you find as accessible as we could make it. Thank you to Penny Edwards, Alex Martinez, Bob Lojano, and Yvonne Reese for making Haven a truly welcoming space. We are also grateful to our ASL and CART providers for your essential presence and support. And I believe you're going to put the QR code, if somebody wants to follow along on their phone, you can hit the QR code that she's going to put up and follow us through your iPhone. So that's great, thank you. On the back end, thanks to Kenya Harris, who's here tonight, Josie Harbison, and our call center students and volunteers for your help with registration, parking, and more. To the video team, Matt Henton, Ingrid Fowle, Chase Tinnen, Adrian Walston, and Joseph Botkin, thank you for your excellent photo and video artwork. A special shout out. A special shout out and a big thank you to Kimberly Kirkland and UAB Arts and Medicine for being so kind and supportive of our work, and we really appreciate what you're doing to again build Birmingham as a go-to place for understanding disability and for allowing people to come here for this wonderful Disability Arts Festival, which she's having throughout the year. And this weekend is an event called From Where I Sit, tomorrow night at 6 p.m. over at UAB Performing Arts, Aviva. There'll be a discussion. And then on Saturday, 7 p.m. and Sunday matinee at 2 p.m., there'll actually be a live performance. So again, it's called From Where I Sit, and I hope you can come out and see that as well. Thank you to Burdock Book Collective for supporting Riva and Rosemarie's work throughout book sales tonight, and the books will be available after the Q&A. And finally, thank you to Dean Butler. He's been immensely supportive. As a dean, I've not been, in my 44 years in higher education, with a stronger and more supportive dean than Dean Andrew Butler. So let's give him a big round of applause for everything he's doing. And a special thanks to Dean Jeff Holmes, who's also out here. He's the Dean of the School of Engineering. So thank you for coming out with your wife. We really appreciate your presence. Thank you. Okay, with that, let's go ahead and begin the event. I'm going to introduce the moderator right now. That's Bob Lojano. Bob is an expert information specialist here at NCHPAD, where he connects individuals with disabilities to free personalized wellness resources and program. He's also a co-star of the Academy Award-nominated documentary Murder Ball. He is the author of No Arms, No Legs, No Problem, and he's a 2004 Paralympic bronze medalist in wheelchair rugby for Team USA. On a special note, Bob and I went to a conference together in Netanya, Israel in 2015, almost 10 years ago, and we had one of the most amazing trips that you could ever imagine, visiting the entire country, seeing all these historic sites, everything from Masada, which was King Herod's desert retreat, BC, an amazing piece of architecture, engineering-wise. We went and swam, floated in the Dead Sea. Do not get any water in your eyes. It burns like heck, which I found out from just a little bit of a splash. Jerusalem and Bethlehem were incredible sites. We went all over. And what was so amazing, as you can imagine, there's no retrofitting in Israel. They're not going to retrofit Jerusalem or Bethlehem. And Bob got around, and it wasn't a place where he couldn't get into or figure out how to get into. So his amazing physical fitness really showed. And we thank you for demonstrating to the world that, you can make things architecturally accessible with persistence and resilience. So thank you. We had a great time. We bonded. And it was the best trip of my life. I know my wife's in the audience, and we've been all over the country. She didn't come on this trip, but I have to say, honestly, that was the best trip. Not because she didn't come, but because it was just full of history, and we really had a great time. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to my dear friend and colleague, Mr. Bob Lehrer. Bob?
Go ahead. Thank you. Thanks, Doc. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. All righty. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our two guests today and give a little bit of their bio. Riva Lehrer, the artist of the work of art on display tonight, which is entitled Portrait of Rosemarie Garland-Thomson, is an artist, writer, and curator who focuses on the socially challenged body. She is best known for representations of people whose physical embodiment, sexuality, or gender identity have long been stigmatized. Her work has been exhibited in several venues, including the Museum of Contemporary Art of Chicago, National Portrait Gallery of the Smithsonian, the Hirshhorn Museum, Museum of Contemporary Art of San Diego, Yale University, the United Nations, the National Museum of Women in the Arts, the Arnott Museum, the Decorah Museum, the Frye Museum, and the Chicago Cultural Center. Her awards, and there are many, include the 2020 Ford Foundation Fellowship, 2017 Three Arts McDowell Fellowship, 2014 Carnegie Mellon Fellowship, 2006 Wynne Newhouse Foundation Grant, the Illinois Arts Council grants, and the National Endowment for the Arts grant. Lehrer's memoir, which is sold over here by the entrance, Gollum Girl, was published in October 2020. One World Penguin Random House. Won the 2020 Barbellion Prize for Literature and was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. She is represented by the Regal Hoffman and Associates and by Zola Lieberman Gallery. Lear was a longtime faculty member of the School of Art Institute of Chicago and is currently an instructor in medical humanities at Northwestern University. Incredible resume. Our next speaker is Rosemarie Garland-Thomson. Rosemarie Garland-Thomson, the subject of the work of art on display tonight, is Professor Emerita of English and Bioethics at Emory University. Her expertise in disability bioethics, critical disability studies, and health humanities bring disability culture, ethics, and justice to a broad range of institutions and communities. She is a Hastings Center Fellow and Senior Advisor, a National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar, a Phi Beta Kappa Visiting Scholar, and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She is co-editor of About Us, essays from the New York Times about disability by people with disabilities, and author of Staring, How We Look, and several other books. Please give it up for both of our guests. We'll go ahead and turn it over to Ms. Riva.
Oh, okay. Am I live?
Yes.
Different than am I alive, which is a complicated question some days. Okay. First, I want to echo the thanks that Jim gave. I'm so honored and moved that this now belongs to you guys. It's an amazing experience, and I want to deeply thank Dean Butler for supporting Dr. Rimmer, and who surprised the heck out of me by saying that he wanted it. Like, oh, I like you. And then the team here that's been making this possible, particularly the amazing and wonderful Megan Mills, who just is patient and, you know, put up with all my, in Yiddish you say spilkies. So anybody that knows what that means, you're in the in crowd tonight. Rosemarie and I are going to talk in depth about the portrait, but I want to thank her before I go any farther, that she trusted me to create a representation, and as we'll discuss, my history of working with people who have had very fraught experiences of being looked at has been a joy from day one and has changed who I am profoundly. So one of the things that changed me also very profoundly, let's see, where is my, this is the game show part of the program. Whoa, they fall over the chair. Where I show you the item of great desire. This is Golem Girl, and I'm going to read a chapter, slightly edited, from the memoir, because my experience at the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia was one of the really major turning points of my life, and also is deeply embedded in what Rosemarie and I did together. So are we ready, slide runners? We good? And we have been trying to get the sun to go down faster. It's just everybody chanting. Okay, sundown, sundown. So that you guys can see the slides. I really invite anyone to move up a little bit so you can see the slides, see our captioners, and especially see the portrait. Okay. So every chapter in the memoir is titled after a horror film or a horror novel, something like that. So the title of this one is called The Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Philadelphia, November 2006. Are we good on sound? Just before I go any, we're good? All right. November on the East Coast was autumn in its original factory settings. The air was sharp and clear as beveled glass, the sky a glaze of luminous blue. Audrey and I made our way among the tilting sidewalks of Philadelphia, where buildings warped and sagged as if begging to lie down after centuries of upright behavior. Our route bristled with plaques on poles. Near here, silversmith Philip Sign Jr. created the inkstand used to sign the Declaration, and on and on. After an hour of touristy lostness, we fetched up in front of a somber hulk of red Georgian brick. Among the door was carved the College of Physicians. This was confusing. Audrey jogged my arm, and there, concealed among the welter of pilasters, scrollwork, and dentate cornice lines, was a square bronze sign, the Mutter Museum. We traded wicked grins. Here we go. The Mutter's white marble lobby serves as a cooling off place in which visitors can pause and consider what lies ahead. A scholar friend of mine told me that in the 19th century, the lobby held a large vat of formaldehyde. Physicians stopped by to deposit the most intriguing specimens they gleaned during that day's surgery. At night, a technician fished out these offerings and preserved them for collection. Just keep that in your head for a minute. You've got a vat of body parts, and somebody comes by with a little white goldfish net and gets them out at night. I've never forgotten that. These days, there was no font, only benches, and a rather fatuous gift shop. The Mutter Museum began as the private collection of Dr. Thomas Dent Mutter. In 1858, Dr. Mutter donated it to the Philadelphia College of Surgeons to be used as a teaching tool for the medical school. The collection remained private for decades, but in the 1970s, the museum was opened to the public and now claimed to host over 130,000 visitors per year. The website someone also finds the Mutter Museum very disturbing. I am sorry, it is what it is. I've tried. I talked to them, they don't listen. Okay. The website tantalized with images of famous exhibits, including the plaster death cast of Chang and Ang Bunker, the original, quote, Siamese twins, the skeletons of Harry Eastlack and of the so-called Kentucky Giant, and the megacolon, a body part that seemed to have escaped from the Marianas Trench. Some exhibits featured normative bodies, but the focus of the collection was on disabilities, primarily those resulting from injury, disease, and birth anomaly. I was there in my guise as anatomy instructor. Audrey was doing research for a book. Neither one of us was motivated by the Mutter's reputation as one of the, quote, 10 creepiest museums in the world. Of course not. The Mutter couldn't decide whether to be a teaching museum or Roger Corman's House of Horrors. The ambience encouraged desire for the outre, while reassuring the viewer that such desires were respectable when making feints towards education. These attempts were unserious in the extreme. The labels were so old and spidery as to be indecipherable, and a general air of boogity-boo pervaded what information there was, as shock value took precedence over deeper knowledge. It came as no surprise that the Mutter's big yearly event was an all-night sleepover on All Hallows Eve. Can you guys see the slides? Are we seeing any of? Excellent. Some of these were kind of semi-smuggled. To be discussed later. The Mutter's been in the news quite a bit for any of you who've been following what's going on there. Anyway, the upper floor of the Mutter Museum was dominated by the Hurdle skull collection, 139 skulls that lined an entire wall. I couldn't help showing off. See that lump sticking out along his jaw? That mandible was broken at some point and healed badly. And those thin zygomatic arches, bad nutrition. That skull is female. Men have a heavier brow ridge. Audrey turned towards me, raised an eyebrow. Pedantic much? We viewed the soap lady, the saponified woman in her Sleeping Beauty coffin, goggled at the collection of objects people had swallowed and then retrieved from their gullets by the also ghastly Dr. Chevalier Jackson, where upstairs was a dry boneyard. The lower level was replete with, quote, wet items in jars, as well as more bony spectacles. The air reeked of chemicals. Audrey turned a wider shade of puke. A large specimen vitrine had cracked down one side. We suspected that the Mutter was trying to stealth embalm a visitor or two. We stood in front of the skeleton of Harry Eastlack, whose fibrodysplasia ossificans progressiva had caused webs and streamers and sheets of calcium to form inside his body, as if Eastlack was growing a suit of armor from the inside out. Audrey pondered, how does something like that ever happen? It's like he was attacked by malevolent spiders. Not sure, some immune system thing. Maybe his bones kept thinking they were broken and never stopped trying to repair themselves, like a car alarm that won't turn off. She said, sometimes I wish I didn't know about these things. I'll probably have nightmares. That looks extremely uncomfortable. I snorted. $10 says Harry's going to show up in your next aquatent. On one hand, the Mutter was a matchless compendium of human variation, a primer on the intersection of nature and chance, on biology as half order, half chaos. But too many exhibits stank of the sideshow. One floor-to-ceiling case held the skeleton of the so-called Kentucky Giant, who parenthetically did not want his body on display. Another story. It stood between an unidentified male skeleton of, quote, normal height and the little person skeleton of Mary Ashbury. This was no benign comment on human morphology. The average male skeleton was only there to emphasize the abnormality of the other two on display, and most gallingly, the skull of Mary's stillborn infant had been plopped on the floor at her feet, and Mary had died in childbirth. When disabled bodies are displayed in public, they usually fulfill one of two purposes. Some, such as the Mutter's head of a head of a woman with a cutaneous horn, illustrate a condition that medicine claims to have cured out of existence. The viewer is safe, that is, they will never be beset by that particular impairment. Other bodies, like Chang and Eng, represent conditions that medicine promises to eradicate. Modern medicine assures us that such impairments will be left in the past or be gone in the imminent future. The Mutter specimens exist in a split timeline, a tempest bifida, that flows around us on either side, leaving us, the viewers, untouched in the present moment. It's a pressure to cure that amounts to eradication. A school group poured into the museums with their shrieks and giggles of, "No way, is that real? Gross!" They stared at me as if I were an exhibit come to life. I'd lost Audrey somewhere in the maze of cases, and as I wandered off in search of her, I passed a sizable cabinet in the middle of the room. Its shelves were laden with jars of preserved fetuses and stillborn infants. I stopped. I'd never really looked at such specimens. They seemed to have had either significantly more or rather less than the regulation number of parts, and their labels were redolent of Greek mythology: phocomelia, ceronomelia, hydrocephalus, anencephaly, polydactyly, whole and prosencephaly, and gastroschisis. I saw multiple pairs of co-joined twins merged at the head or the heart or the spine. All the specimens had long ago lost their baby pink color and bleached to an aqueous ivory. I concentrated on what embryology I could remember, and I thought I was being wonderfully objective, which stopped as soon as I reached the middle of the case. There was my body. To be exact, bodies. 2 entire shelves of jars dedicated to spina bifida. One fetus had my precise version, spina bifida lipomyelin. I haven't practiced it today. Spina bifida lipomyelin meningocele. There I was, the infant who had emerged from my mother's body. This infant, this astonishment, this red birthday balloon, this me in taxidermy, this me. The specimens were much older than I was. Immersion had swollen their bodies until they'd become too big for their containers, inmates pushing against the bars of their cells. Their faces were turned to the wall, but even so, those eyes pulled me straight through the glass. I, the anatomy professor, had never gone looking for photos of spina bifida. Deep down, I hadn't wanted to know. I leaned my forehead against the case. Audrey found me and wrapped her hand around my arm, worried that I might faint. A century had passed since the Mutter Museum fetuses were preserved, yet they still floated inside their round glass houses, naked and ancient as cave fish. Museum labels told us how and where to look, in text written for the able-bodied as they looked upon the abnormal. Where had they come from? Why was the Mutter their final resting place? Of this, nothing was said. The fetuses were perfectly ahistorical bodies. And like the jar children, my body was a marker in time. In a way, I too had no history, no spina bifida elders to show me how to age. Parenthetically, I am 67. I know very few people my age with my impairment. Those jar babies were my ancestors. And yet, the jar children relieved me of a loneliness that I never even knew I had. They brought me to a place past words, past analysis or politics, or even beauty. I longed to slip a jar of siblings into my purse. I leaned my palms against the chilly glass and wished for the 10,000th time that I could ask my mother anything at all. Thank you. Could someone move this to the side for us, or would you like it? Wait, Rosemarie, do you want this stand? Here, let me get my stuff off of it. Could someone give us a hand for a moment, please? Would you like it brought over to you?
Yeah, that'd be great.
All right.
And, well, could we make it a little lower?
Right there.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim Rimmer, for many things, including bringing us together in this setting, for bringing Riva and me together. We've been friends for, we decided, maybe 25 years. Yeah. And for bringing the three of us, if you will, together on the stage before you all. Three of us being my beloved friend Riva, myself, and this portrait that Riva has made. And I'd like to talk with you a little bit tonight. I also want to thank not just Jim Rimmer, but the entire University of Alabama Professional School of Health Sciences. Have I got that title proper? And I've had a little bit of an opportunity the last couple of days to be in those spaces and with some of the people that participate in that community, and it's very impressive and very moving, so it's something that maybe we'll be able to talk about a little bit later. I wanted to use my time here to reflect a little bit on what I call, Bob was kind enough to remind you that I'm an English teacher, so that means that I love words and I'm also quite pretentious. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about what I call the cultural work of portraits in general, and also in particular the cultural work of what I call picturing people with disabilities. So I'm going to share with you a few images, which I think will, at this time, because it's got a little bit darker, be fairly accessible to you on the screen there, and to talk a little bit about, as I said, what I call the cultural, and maybe we'll also call it the moral work of portraiture, particularly portraits of people with disabilities. So help me out. Does it say picturing people with disabilities up there? Yes. Wonderful. So I'll introduce myself with a slide that has an alternative form of introducing myself. So this introductory slide has a photograph of me, an image of me that is accessible visually to the audience, and then I have a description of myself here that I'm going to read to you so that I will be available to you in three forms: the live form, the image, the photographic image, and a description of myself. So Rosemarie Garland-Thomson, pictured here, is a pale-skinned middle-aged woman with silver chin-length hair, straight hair, reddish lipstick, wearing round black glasses, and a black jacket. She's pictured here in a professional headshot taken in the living room of her apartment in San Francisco. And I should mention, Riva and I will talk a little bit about that more in our question and answer period. It was my living room in San Francisco where I sat for Riva's portrait because it took place during the pandemic. So we'll talk a little bit more about the creation of the portrait. But I want to begin here with a premise, and that is that disability art, that is to say art about and by people with disabilities, and disability as a concept in general, offers opportunities to explore, to redefine, and to make new stories about what it means to be human. And I'm showing here an image from a disabled artist whose name is Catherine Sherwood. This is a piece of Catherine's art that's very distinctive. Catherine has always been a painter, and about 25 years ago, Catherine had a cerebral hemorrhage, that is to say, a stroke, a brain event, which changed both her body, her mind, her art, and her relationship with her art. So Catherine had painted with her right hand, and as a result of this brain aneurysm, this stroke, she needed to paint and to learn to paint with her left hand, which apparently is a challenge for people. It's something I don't understand very well. But Catherine changed the way she did art and the subject of her art. And the way she changed it is that she took images of her brain, X-rays, images, CT scans, this sort of thing, of her brain, which was the focus of her medical treatment, of course. It was a representation of her, and she put those images in every single one of the pieces of art that she did after her body became disabled and she became a person with a disability. So this particular portrait is from her Olympia series, which is an allusion, that is to say a reference to the painting Olympia by the 19th century artist Manet. And what she did is to take the familiar Olympia from Manet and to outfit it as a disabled person, in this case a disabled odalisque, by giving it the face of Catherine Sherwood's X-ray, by giving it hair that was made out of images of Catherine Sherwood's CT scans and her images, and putting a leg brace on this particular odalisque. So this reference, of course, draws from a kind of cultural familiarity of other artwork. And I'm going to continue that theme a little bit in some of the images I'll share with you. The next slide is another image of one of Catherine Sherwood's paintings, where she has taken an Ong portrait and put an arm brace on this particular odalisque. And I'm going to offer you a definition here, and that is of what I think portraits of people with disabilities do. They do many things, but one of the things they do and are is that they are reconstructive narratives. In other words, they reconstruct our images. Catherine Sherwood reconstructed Manet's images into something else that was distinctive of Catherine's art practice, just as Riva Lehrer, and we'll look at more of these images, does with her own work. So I wanted to talk about portraits of people with disabilities as being reconstructive narratives and also being pieces of art that change the story. I myself am interested in changing the stories that we receive to make and remake stories about disability, and we'll talk more about that. And I'll offer you a definition here of reconstructive narratives that comes from my colleague, the bioethicist Jackie Leach Scully, who tells us that these new stories, whether they're textual stories or imagistic stories, are alternative and morally less harmful accounts. And I like to think about Riva's work as being a morally less harmful account that serve to displace more damaging portrayals of people with disabilities. And we can talk more about that. And I'll share a few portraits here. Bob is going to keep me on time here. This is one of what is called the Lost Portraits. It's a picture by the artist Chris Rush, done in 2000. And it's a picture of a woman with an unusual face. She looks something like a 1920s modern woman, dressed in black, a little bit of an Audrey Hepburn image here, with her hand laid across her chest in a beautiful gesture. And this redefinition, this retelling of what we think of as an unusual face, even what we think of as a deformed face, I want to suggest is a portrait of a person with a disability that changes the story about what we think of as medical conditions or genetic conditions. And we can talk more about that. Another portrait by Doug Auld of a woman named Shayla. And I want to make sure that's up there because I can't see. It's a portrait and it says Shayla. Okay, thank you very much. This is done in 2005. Doug Auld painted a series of portraits of people who had significant burn scarring on their faces. And these people contributed and cooperated with Doug Auld in making these portraits because they wanted the viewers of these portraits to see the beauty of their new faces. And I think this series, you can go find this series and take a look at them, is a really interesting experiment and what oils can do in texturing the face of someone with significant burn scarring. The next portrait is by Chris Rush again. This is called Swim 2. It's a profile portrait in which Chris Rush paints a picture of a woman with Down syndrome. And he shows this woman with a beautiful turban made out of a beach towel and a pose that, in my view, has great dignity. It's a profile pose, like many of the Renaissance portraits, of this woman who belongs to a species of persons who are being eliminated from the world in very high percentages. And so I want to suggest that this portrait endows this woman with great poise and honor and dignity. I'll show you next a different kind of portrait, a marble sculpture done by the artist Mark Quinn called Alison Lapper Pregnant. Alison Lapper is an armless and legless woman. This rested in Trafalgar Square in 2005 to show a typical kind of portrait that we're very familiar with, but in a very unusual form. It's done in white marble. And the next portrait, or the next image I want to show you here, illustrates the way that art in particular can, as I showed you with Catherine Sherwood's work, make allusions to other art. And I want to suggest that the people that were able to view Mark Quinn's portrait in Trafalgar Square would have been familiar, of course, with perhaps the most famous armless beauty in all of Western culture, and that, of course, is the Venus de Milo, done in 100 BCE. So there's an intertextuality, if you will, in these paintings. I'm going to show one more picture here, and that is one of Riva's earlier pictures, and it's a portrait of Susan Nussbaum, a well-known writer and playwright, And I've shown this image very many times because it's a kind of classical portrait in the sense that it shows the person that is being honored by the portrait in a costume that is suggestive of the work of the person that is being honored by this portrait, and usually surrounds the subject of the portrait with some of the tools of the subject's trade. So this is, I think, a particularly lovely example of how this classical portraiture works in some of Riva's earlier work. So we have Susan Nussbaum here, seated in her wheelchair, with a beautiful scarf across her, looking very writerly in my view, leaning forward. She's surrounded by a variety of other objects, a pen, a few other things. She's in her apartment with a background of the city in which she lives. And so this is a very classical kind of portrait that tells you a lot about the subject. It tells you that this is a person of importance. It tells you that this is a person who's a writer. And it also makes a reference, Riva says that this is an unintentional reference, but I always like to put forward the comparison here between this picture of the writer Susan Nussbaum and, of course, the Pablo Picasso portrait, very famous portrait of the writer Gertrude Stein, who's in a very similar pose in this very, very famous 1906 portrait of Gertrude Stein by Pablo Picasso. How are we doing for time? 1 more minute. 1 more minute? All right. These images can be made available to you. Somebody will put them together in the form of a PDF if you'd like to have these images sent to you so you can review them somewhat, because I have a few other images that I will skip over. And come to the very last portrait. Tell me if there is a portrait there of Christopher Reeve and Abraham Lincoln. No? There? Okay, thank you. I wanted to end with this portrait, which I think is really important for several reasons. It's a portrait done by Sasha Newley of Christopher Reeve. And you may recall that Christopher Reeve was famous for being Superman. And that in an instant, Christopher Reeve transformed as a result of a riding accident from Superman into a person with quadriplegia. And I find this portrait of Christopher Reeve to be very moving because I think that it captures a tremendous amount of dignity in a very quieted body. And I think it's quite ironic and telling that Christopher Reeve did some of the most important work of his career after he became quadriplegic. And that Sasha Newley painted this work of Christopher Reeve, and it has been acquired by the National Portrait Gallery, and occasionally it is on display in the National Portrait Gallery. And I saw it in the National Portrait Gallery between an image of Rosa Parks in the National Portrait Gallery and Martin Luther King. And I was very moved by the reference, of course, to the Black Civil Rights Movement and the Disability Rights Movement, and to put them into the same choreography of arrangement there. And of course, I want to suggest, again, that many of us are familiar with the Lincoln Memorial and that very famous sculpture of Abraham Lincoln, not in an upright pose, but rather in a seated pose in the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., and to suggest that there is a kind of intertextual set of references, not necessarily intentional, but between this public picture of Christopher Reeve and this public piece of art of Abraham Lincoln. And so the juxtaposition of these two works in our nation's capital, in Washington, D.C., tells a story about disability rights, disability culture, and lives lived well. So, thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. Thank you, ladies. We've now moved on to, I guess, questions and answers for anyone that may have for our guests. Someone will be having a microphone and go around. Or discussion, sorry. Yep, my apologies. Yes, discussion between the two ladies. So go ahead.
Each other now, right?
We're going to
Yes,
talk
you're
to
gonna
each
talk
other.
to each
Am I
other.
live?
And Bob's going to tell us when we have to stop talking about each other and with each other.
We're gonna need that in our daily life, Bob.
Yeah.
You know,
That's fine.
both very verbal. Well, so one thing I wanted to do is explain the construction of the painting.
Right, let me move this thing.
So, can you all hear me? I don't have my
Yes.
jacket over the
Is this-
mic.
No, that's fine.
So, because Rosemarie and I started during COVID, our process was not the normal one that I use for portraits. Normally, the person I'm working with is there with me in the studio, and that's really the center of my process. If you read the book or follow me wherever, I talk all the time about the transformational space in the studio. But we were really up against it. COVID just kept rising up, and you'd think that you were free to travel, and then it would come back in some other form. And so I did the portrait remotely. I commissioned photographs in San Francisco, where a photographer came to Rosemarie's house and took pictures. And then there were one or two events where Rosie and I were at the same conference, and I took more pictures, and then sometimes we'd be over Zoom, and I was just trying to cobble together reality from a distance. But I was thinking a lot as things went on. So the image, which I'll ask Rosie to talk at the vitrine aspect, I'll ask Rosemarie to talk about, but here's the overall way that the painting came together. So the painting, and I think I've told you this, but I don't actually remember. The painting is not exactly what you think it is. It's the story of time. So the construction is a fractured hourglass. So if you look at where the scarf is draped, if you imagine the wasp waist of a traditional hourglass, you've got the upper portion, and when Rosemarie and I first met, she always had a scarf or a shawl or a very loose coat or something, and was generally hiding her arms and hands. And
Well, I should also say that sleeves are never my friends. And so a scarf or a shawl becomes a really nice way to keep myself wrapped and
yes,
warm.
right, I mean, it wasn't
And to
entirely
be pretentious.
like I'm not. But I ended up seeing the scarf and placing the scarf in a way that it was the top of the hourglass and this kind of downward draping to get the feeling of something starting to funnel. And then if you look, it comes down to two things, the vitrine, but also the second scarf. And the second scarf, which is falling off her shoulders, is, for me, it's water. I mean, it's actually a pattern of like vines and roots and leaves, but the way it flowed kept feeling like blue water. So I wanted to continue the propulsion of time coming down, but then it hits the pinch point, which is both the midpoint of the body, but more importantly, the vitrine. And then it opens up again at the skirt. So you have this whole, this dominant hourglass. And what the hourglass is about is the way in which the body that we're born into is going to dictate so much of the story of our life. You know, if you have a normative body, you have certain possibilities. If your body is not normative or becomes non-normative, and these are all terrible terms. I'm using them as shorthand for a lot of things I'd like to say.
Better than
But-
deformed.
Oh, I won't use deformed. I mean, I'll use anomalous, which is a little different, but usually I use variant.
And I say unusual.
Yeah, all these things that we run into. But the body, the fetus, which I want to let you talk about, but it's going all the way back at the beginning of Rosemarie's story. So it was my imagining of what she might have looked at like near birth, you know, almost full term. And so you have this weight of time and flow hitting this almost cage-like vitrine. If you see it up front, you'll see that I chose to paint it with these striations in the glass that are just a little bit like a cage, and then opening up again towards the bottom. So I thought a lot while I was working on this about, and I've certainly done work about this in my own life, about this moment, the birth moment, and what flows from the birth moment. So that's what the painting's about for me, but it's about something else for Rosemarie. So let me stop, and if you would talk about what it is for you.
Well, Riva and I have been friends, as we mentioned, for a very long time, and I've shown her art, followed her art, participated in events about her art and other forms of art. And I had wanted for a long time for Riva to paint a portrait of me. And what I had said to her and what I wanted the portrait to do is for it to be a portrait of my hands, more than a portrait of my face. So classical portraiture, the kind of portraits that I showed you, typically show a face in the center of interest. The face is the center of a portrait, usually, in the sense that it is what conveys recognition. It's what makes the viewer be able to say, oh yes, that's so-and-so. I recognize that, that's who that is. If you ever go to Washington, D.C. to the National Portrait Gallery, I love to go to the president's section where they have an official portrait of every president, starting with George Washington. And of course, the recognition factor is mostly in the face. And so it occurred to us working together that to recognize me, to be able to distinguish me from other people, my face is not as important as my hands are, because my hands are distinctive and unusual, and they are
Beautiful.
well, thank you. I've spent much of my life managing my personal persona, I suppose, as we all have, by saying something like, watch my mouth, watch my face, don't pay much attention to my hands. I often have them kind of tucked away. And so it was really an important decision about what I call the choreographing of the portrait, for it to be a portrait of my hands more than a portrait of my face. And that's one of the things that I think makes this a distinctive kind of portrait. Perhaps a little bit in the way that Christopher Reeve's portrait that I just showed, that wheelchair does a lot of work in the way that I feel that the hands and putting the hands in the center. And it was Riva's idea, I think, to put what I called the jar, until she told me it was a vitrine, with a fetus in my hands. And I think that the portrait begins to have a message that is, if you'll pardon my pun, somewhat heavy-handed, in the sense that I've been doing work, as I suggested, in bioethics and thinking about the ethics of reproductive technology, the ethics of developing genetic interventions, the ethics of, to use Riva's term, normalizing human beings in the interest of making them more acceptable and making them happier and giving them a so-called higher quality of life. And much of the work that we do together in disability culture, as well as now I'm working in what I call disability bioethics, is to say what this picture says, and that is, this is a person with a genetic condition that is understood as significant, that is understood as perhaps a cause for suffering, a reduction in quality of life, but this is a person who has a high quality of life. This is a person with dignity. This is a person who has a life worth living. And that's what I think Riva has created here. And that's why I am so pleased that this picture, pleased isn't even the right word, why I think it's so important that this picture has found a home in the University of Alabama's School for Health Sciences. I left out a word or two in there, but where it's going to live. Because that's where that's the audience I wanted for it, and I wanted it to be there to say what it says.
Well, I would just add a couple of things, which is, I know that you experience as a portrait of your hands. I worked very hard on what the relationship of your hands and your face was going to be. When I hope you don't mind if I say this, but when we did our initial photo shoot, I was art directing over Zoom, which was an experience, and then I was taking these follow-up shots to get some close-ups. And the first expressions that you gave me, I don't know how many people can see this, but was this. Like, Rosemary, I can't do that. You were like purely skeptical, like, why are you looking at me? I'm like, okay, I'm not gonna paint that. So I had her go through a series of face relaxation exercises that I use with my people. And these things where you crunch your face really hard and you let it go, you smile in different ways, I ask you to think about different things, until I got an expression that for me was both welcoming and a little bit wary. Because for me, that was really where things were, because you were being present, but you also were aware in your expression that people looking at you were going to have a range of experiences.
Yeah.
So you weren't defending yourself, but you were showing an awareness of what being looked at meant. And you nailed it. We finally got a set of references that then I followed up so many times with seeing you, and it wasn't just like one picture and like, there we are. I never worked like that. It's always about dozens and dozens of reference, and mostly people there in my studio, and like I said, this time we weren't blessed with that. But when I work with people, I'm always aware, the people I work with always deal with stigma in some way. That is what's interesting to me. The center of my interest is, do you experience stigma for whatever reason, and how does that affect your work? I never have done a portrait of anyone who was body variant or When I say that, I include things like if you're queer in such a way that you are performing your body, living in your body in a way that gets you identified as queer, identified as trans, in a way that may not have much to do with volitional decision making. It's just authentically who you are. But your authentic self gets you targeted in some way. And certainly now, I don't even have to finish that sentence. Read the paper, y'all. Imagine how bad it is now. So what I want to do is find people who experience this, but then do something performative or academic or literary or something where that awareness goes into their work. So we can have this circular conversation, which we've been able to do like crazy. And so when I'm painting someone's body, drawing someone, I'm always looking at what's the face doing, what's the body doing, what's the environment doing. And I loved the multiple accidents of, this is what's great about not coming in with a big idea. I used to come, like the Susan Nussbaum piece, that's from 1997, 98. When I first started doing portraits, I would interview people a lot and then do little thumbnails based on the stories they told me and come back and say, our next meeting, here are 4 images I got, which one is most true for you? And then we would choose one, and then we would make that, refine it, and we'd make that image happen. With Susan, it is so overladen. In portraiture, those are called attributes. So when you have something like the vitrine or even the costume, all these things, the environment, those are called the attributes, and they are the explainers of the self. And in classical portraiture, I don't know how much time we have, but in classical portraiture, and I'm not asking you,
You're fine.
but this is important for everybody who ever looks at a portrait. Classically speaking, all portraits, just about before the fin de siècle turned to the 20th century, were one of 2 things. They were either a wealthy person commissioning an image because they wanted to display their power to their society.
Their importance.
Their
yeah.
importance. So whether that was political or in terms of royalty or economic or whatever, when you see a lot of portraits of women wearing these fantastic dresses, it wasn't about the women. It was about how wealthy was the husband. So when you would see a Renaissance portrait or afterwards, woman wearing some silk dress, covered in jewels, it's about her husband. So even though she might have been seen as a great beauty, and often you would get that too, but those portraits were the commissioning, the client coming to the artist and saying, I want this, and the artist would have to do that. Whether or not the artist thought it was going to be a good image, they were what I called the sock puppet. Yes, sir, yes, ma'am, I'll do that, and that's what you got. Or the other kind of portrait was an artist seeing someone who is generally of the lower classes saying, you're beautiful, you're interesting, I want to do a portrait of you, but then that person didn't have any power. The artist told them, lean over this way, do this, take off your clothes, whatever. And those were often paid, the artist would be paying the model. So you'd have this power dynamic. Either the client has all the power or the artist has all the power, and that's that. And what I've been working on since I became a portraitist, right from the go, is how can I break that apart? How can I give my subject as much power as I can, and also how can I make myself vulnerable? Because I know that Rosemarie was very vulnerable sitting for me. And I regret that you weren't in, partly because we weren't able to do the things. So like, for instance, what I've done in some of my series is people would come to my studio when it was still in my house. And I did a series, for instance, called The Risk Pictures. And what the risk was that each sitting, they'd commit to at least 5 sittings. Each sitting would be 3 hours long. But at the 2-hour mark, I would get up and put on my coat and get my purse and walk out the door. And before I left, my subject, who's there working on a portrait, they'd get 2 things. Total control of my house, total control. They could do anything they wanted. Eat my food, take my stuff, break things, go through my computer and see my emails to my lovers, I mean, whatever, I used to have a joke that if you found my underwear on eBay, for God's sake, call me. But in exchange, they had to alter their portrait. They'd get all my art supplies, and they had to do something to take responsibility for their own representation. And so the risk was that they would ruin it. It was possible they would ruin it. He also finds this disturbing. This kid and I are like this, and the things that we find upsetting. So I was risking everything, all my belongings, my reputation, and my livelihood. And they were risking how I was going to show who they were to a public world. So I've done variations on this, ways of being vulnerable. And so this is been fascinating because I keep having to find ways to tear myself down. And right now I'm working on a portrait of someone who has gone through catastrophic surgery. And it's a form of surgery that looked like I was going to have a number of times in my life that made me want to die. I was so terrified of it. It hasn't happened yet, but he's had it twice. And so I've never worked with anyone whose surgical history scares me so badly, and that I am so private about. I am so private about this. But I've decided to do his portrait. And so once I start showing it in public, I'm going to be honest and say, this is like my biggest fear, what I've just painted.
Yike.
So it's always about how can I open myself up, tear myself apart, so that when I'm with someone, I'm risking something real, So that's the most important thing for you to know about portraiture and about how to look at what you see in a museum. There's a lot of bullshit that goes on in power portraits. I wish I had time to tell you about it. But next time you see a portrait of someone important, ask yourself, do I see bullshit here? I promise you will. I'll just tell you one thing. Most portraits of important people have been of white people, right? Where do you think the tradition of the dark background comes from? It's, I think, in part to emphasize whiteness. It does a lot of different things, but one of the things it does is emphasize whiteness. And that is one of the bullshit things that you will see.
How are we doing?
Oh, well, you're doing very well.
Do we want to do Q&A or?
You want to wrap up? You can. All right.
We would love questions.
The ladies want to go to the Q&A part of the evening. So if no one has anything, I actually have a couple, but I'll defer.
Will you call on people? Is that how we're?
Yeah, I believe there's
people
a mic. Someone will just say they want a question, and we'll bring a microphone over to you,
Mic over, yeah.
and then you can ask your question. So, but just to get the ball rolling, I guess, what struck me was just what you were holding when I first, saw the portrait, and I guess why that image was chosen, and maybe not a rose or
Right.
exactly. So that was the first question with in my mind. And I guess the only reason why I thought of a rose is because it's something beautiful, something that would stand out and bring more to your hands, I guess, just in my opinion. So.
Well, that would have been that would have told a different story. And I think it would
Is
have been a
your
good
mic on?
story.
Is Rosemary's mic on?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, it didn't sound like it for a minute. Go on.
That would have told a different story. And, you know, like Riva said at the beginning, I too have visited medical museums, the Mutter Museum, as well as other medical museums. You should go to one if you haven't had a chance. There are lots of them around. And I too have seen jars with fetuses that had bodies like mine. And it's unsettling.
Yeah.
I think maybe particularly for people with unusual bodies like mine, where I've never seen other people who have the same kinds of hands as me. And to see something quite similar in a jar is, well, unsettling is the word I'd like to use to describe it, but there would be many ways of thinking about that way of viewing, you know, as Riva suggested, my ancestors.
I mean, because we know each other, I know that we have friends in common that also have versions of syndactyly
Right.
or polydactyly, and I've seen the intensity of feeling and connection that you have with those friends. There's a kind of joy that I've seen when we've all been together, and like Sandy or Matt or, and you know, you may not on the surface seem to share much life biography with them, but then you do. And it's all spoken and unspoken, and I've loved being around when we get to be with the people who get you on a level that I never will have the opportunity to.
Well, many of us that work together in higher education and the arts and culture, who work in disability studies and culture and live with disabilities, share a biography that I think is pretty common, and that is, growing up, I never knew anybody who had a disability. I was able to go to public schools because I could get in the door. And so the things that I wasn't, there was no concept of adaptive anything when I was going to school. So whatever it was that we were being asked to do as students, if I couldn't do it, I just sat quietly and, or stood on the sidelines or something like that. So I had not ever really known or met anyone else, I thought, with a disability. And so I was quite isolated, and I certainly didn't understand myself as a disabled person because it was before the disability rights movement that that word would not have resonated with me. My parents, of course, knew nothing about the disability rights movement. And so there was an isolation that many of us experienced. And then when we started working together in professional organizations and higher education, in arts, when we started to find each other, so to speak, there was a sense of bonding that I think was quite surprising because so many of us had had these isolating experiences as children.
Well, my experience is absolutely the opposite. It's so interesting.
Well, exactly, because we went to different schools.
Well, I mean, this is my quibble with mainstream, which I'll get to in a moment. So
by that you mean mainstream education?
Yeah. So quibble is an understatement. So in the book, I talk about having gone, in fact, okay, in the book, I talk about this. You won't be able to see it, but it's a little gold medallion. And what the medallion is that I went to some place called Candid School from kindergarten to 8th grade. And it was entirely a school for children with disabilities. Growing up, it was called by the general populace, the retard school. Sorry for the word, but that's what we would get screamed at. Our school bus would get screamed at corners, and people would throw things. It was lovely. But it was a school entirely for kids with disabilities, mostly mobility-oriented disabilities, but there was a range. And I was terrified to leave it at the end of 8th grade, because every day I had a school day where I wasn't the only one of my kind. And as soon as I left, then I became a freak and a monster. But in school, I was a kid. So for my 8th grade graduation present, I asked for this medallion, and it says Condon School 63 to 72, and I wore it all the way through high school, where I was the only disabled kid that I know of in the entire high school, including K through 12, this school. I was the only one, at least the only one I ever saw or knew of. And so when I left high school and went to college, I was so bullied and isolated then because I didn't have any disabled friends. And so I spent most of my adult life running away from being disabled. I knew I was, but I denied it as ferociously as I could. I wouldn't talk about anything. I hated asking for help. I tried to be normal. I wore big baggy clothes so nobody could see my body. And then in '97, I met Susan Nussbaum, who we've talked about, the playwright. And we became friends, and Susan said to me, "You're coming to this meeting I'm part of, the Disabled Artists Coalition Collective." I always get that wrong. And I said, "Oh, no, I'm not." It sounds awful. Why would she want to be something, you know? Because I'd been in like special arts groups, and it was always people sitting here going, "We don't have any career, everybody hates us, everybody hates Jewish artists, queer artists, Cincinnati artists, short artists, whatever." It was always like a pity me group, and I thought, well, disabled artists, they're going to be the worst. They're just going to be like, wow. But she was like, "You don't have a choice, haha. If you want to be my friend, you're going to come to this thing." So I went, and it was one of the transformative moments in my life, because these people were hilarious, and they were fierce, and they were theorists, and they knew about disability, culture, and disability studies. I didn't know anything. I knew nothing. And they're like, "You idiot," in a nice way, kind of. And I started learning, and I learned, you know, the word crip, which is what I call myself. I learned social model versus medical model. I learned all that stuff. And then I started going to Society for Disability Studies. And Susan died a couple years ago, which still breaks my, like, I can't talk about it, but that woman saved my life. My community saved my life. These portraits saved me. And I'm trying to help a friend right now who has MS, who's completely detached from disabilities community, and it's what she desperately needs. And the little bits that I've gotten her to come into, I can see where they light her up. And I see out in the audience a number of us. I'm so grateful you're here. You know, I want you to ask questions, tell us about what it's like to be represented. If you've ever seen yourself well represented, or what you think about the representations you see in our culture, because we're saving each other. So.
Sure, yeah. Are there any questions?
Yeah,
anyone?
please.
If not, I have a follow-up.
We have a hot mic ready to go.
Oh, we have someone raising their hand. There we go.
Right here.
Yeah, thank you for using the mic, so we'll have what I call a robust auditory environment.
Hey, I'm Lauren. So I'm a sophomore at UAV. And so I think for me, growing up, I really didn't think about how I had a disability. I just knew that I was different, and I used a walker, and that was kind kind of it. I didn't think anything about it. And so it wasn't really until, I guess, high school that I kind of was like, oh, I started learning more about people with different disabilities, like intellectual and physical. And so I think that it's just so important that we educate people from a young age. That way they're not just kind of, I guess, clueless of like, why am I so different than everyone else? Because I really was like, why is everyone 2 feet taller than me? Like, just that kind of thing. So I would like to hear your perspectives on that.
May I ask you, when you were in high school or while you're here at the university, have any of your classes included content about the history of disability or the disability rights movement or arts and culture? Have you learned about disability?
So I was actually in a seminar on disability kind of help in my freshman year. And so every week we would have a different speaker come in and tell about what they did, and sometimes they had disabilities and sometimes they worked with people with disabilities. So it's really just been really eye-opening to learn about so many different types of disabilities, really.
Well, I think this is the quibble, capital Q, that I mentioned, which is that I was really lucky to go to a school of Crips because I learned from, 5 years old that people's bodies come in this enormous range. I regret the years that I ran away from that, but when I recognized it again, it was like, here's my country. And the problem with mainstreaming, from what I can see, is that you might have one other kid in your class who has an impairment, maybe. Maybe there's a handful in your school, but you don't necessarily make common cause. A lot of times there's a thing called cumulative stigma, where you're afraid to be with the other Crip kid because you're already trying very hard to be normal, or you're told that you should aspire to something like normalcy, so it's hard to be with the other Crip kids. And my feeling so strongly is that from elementary school, disability history and culture should be part of all curricula.
Yeah.
So that you have a sense of yourself, even if you don't have peers near you in your school to bond with necessarily. You have an identity. And when you're ready, you can find the people you need. Does that sound familiar to you?
Yes, I totally agree with that. I think in school, you learn about things like slavery and, different cultures being excluded and stuff, but you never learn about people with disabilities or anything in the disability movement. And I think that really needs to be incorporated. So, thank you.
We have other questions?
Do we have?
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. Any other questions or?
Thank you, and I really appreciate that.
I know I had kind of one for Riva. I'm sorry if this sounds kind of trite, but how long did it take you to draw this?
19 months.
19 months. Okay, yeah.
The way what you're seeing is, so they start with drawings, scale drawings for a long time, adjusting a little bit here and there. I had to invent the dress, and because you were wearing this black sort of a lycra dress. It looked terrible on film. And I'm like, I can't do anything with this. It's like a black blob. This is not going to work. So I'm like, well, what should she be wearing? And I kept thinking red velvet, but I didn't have anything. So I was going to thrift stores and putting on red velvet dresses and taking pictures of myself in the mirror, going like this to get the skirt. And then I bought some of them because it was thrift stores, and I bring them home. And then I realized that in the photo shoot, your feet weren't there. And to have your feet all the way there meant, if you were doing this, it meant your feet were going to go off the panel. And I had a version of it where your feet went off. I'm like, okay, that looks terrible. So I talked to my friend Tim, and I'm like, what am I going to do? I can't get hold of her. And he goes, well, just bend her knees. And I'm like, oh, right. If I bend her knees, then her feet go under the chair. Yeah. And then I had to find a friend who could wear a pair of ballet flats and bend her knees while I drew her. And, this went on and on and on. So finally I had a study. And then the way that I work is called grisaille. And what a grisaille is, you do the full painting in black and white. And then the color goes on in very thin layers. And one of the things I loved about our photo shoot that I could have normalized, but I didn't, and it's not what you think, but when we did the shoot, on one side, is there a window over there in your apartment? I'm trying to remember which side is the window. Right there, right. This is the window. Of course, because the light coming from this side was sunlight, and the light coming from that side was incandescent light.
Right.
And I could have, made it just one light situation, but I didn't. If you come up and see the portrait, you'll see that it's yellow light on this side from sunshine, and it's blue light on that side from your bulbs, and the overlap is you. And so I wanted to make it subtle, but oh my God, the amount of time I took having to adjust the shadows along the molding and where the orange was going to go along the and it all had to do with the collision of two lighting sources. So it started as a black and white painting, and then everything was layer and layer and layer of thin glaze until I got the full richness of the color. And that just takes forever. So this was 19 months of work. So Bob, thank you for making it a little but financially not insane to do that. Oh my God, that's all I worked on.
I did notice, Rosemarie, that you're not wearing the same type of glasses, or maybe you were in the photo, but not in the painting.
Yeah, I think.
Oh, I changed your glasses. The glasses you were wearing were so dominant that they wiped out your face. So I had to find, I know these aren't really your glasses, but I needed to find a pair that would work well with the color scheme, but let your face come forward primarily. This is not the kind of glasses Rosemarie would normally wear.
Right.
And I wouldn't normally change someone's style, but everything I sketched on, that's all you saw were your glasses. So I needed to make a hard decision, and I just picked a pair of gold wire rims. They're pretty, but they're not your style.
We did spend quite a bit of time talking about my expression. And I think what we landed on was a kind of expression of questioning, of surprise, of why. I would like to think what my face says in this is, why are we doing this? Why are we, not why are we doing the portrait, but why are we
what is this moment?
Devaluating?
What does this moment mean?
Yeah, what does this moment mean? Why are we devaluing the lives of people with disabilities so fully?
I find the people I work with so beautiful and I've written about disability beauty. And the problem is that when people talk about the beauty of the disabled, it's always despite. You know, they're overcoming their impairment, their spirit shines through, their courage shines through. Gag me.
I don't mind it that much.
I do. What I see is something different, which is a deep intentionality of the body. I see people who have body variants as people who know their bodies, have had to wrangle with their bodies, are extremely wise about embodiment, know how people see them in public. They've had to come to accommodations. And there's what I call a thickness. That's what I see, is there's a thickness of the self in disability that I think people who have normative bodies who have not had to be, I think for a lot of us when we get older, if you're able-bodied, that's like, wait a minute, I thought I was this, and now people see me as that. And they're confused and sort of discombobulated. You know, I thought I had X life, and now I'm being told I don't have that life anymore.
I have always said that since disability is a universal condition, that we will all become disabled if we live long enough, that it's a great advantage to start early. Because you learn,
You know?
no, it's true, you learn
Yeah.
management strategies, you learn to work with your body, you don't have a particular, that kind of sense of loss that people often experience when they become disabled later in life.
Or just elderly.
And you develop all sorts of strategies. And that's counterintuitive, I think, in most social and medical situations where the idea is to keep disability off and away as long as possible. And so that's some disability wisdom that I'm not sure everyone would agree with, but I think it's an interesting perception, and that a lot of people who live with disabilities think about.
You know, we don't have time for me to describe my work in medical humanities or where the vitrine came from, unfortunately. There is a chapter about it in the memoir that explains where this came from. Not specifically as portrait, but what my work with fetuses is. But I've been working a lot with doctors lately, and it sounds insane, but what we keep having to say, myself and my compatriots, is we're not tragedies. We're not mistakes, we're not tragedies. You know, think about when you talk to a disabled patient, here's what I want you to ask them. What's the life you're trying to live? And how can what we do together help you live the life that you are striving for or that you are within? You know, because everybody's health is individual. You know, all the magazines tell us health looks like this. No, it doesn't. Health looks like you being able to live the life that you are trying to live.
Thank you.